Alex, thanks for coming in to talk about the affective filter. Now, what can you tell me about the affective filter? It's something to do with crashing, really, isn't it?
Originally, yes, in regard to terms, and hello Ben. Affective filters are essentially a reaction, and if you wanted to say what is an affective filter, it's about an individual's response to the context, to the environment and to input. Now, affective filters may be positive, so if I have a very positive reaction to something, I'm generally going to receive and respond more positively. But affective filters, when they're traditionally referred to, and going back to Krashen and in regard to language learning, is when actually you have an emotional response to that context or the input that's negative. And because it's a negative response, it inhibits my learning. Something's happening up here which stops things going as well as they could. So maybe I'm stressed, maybe I'm unhappy, maybe I feel threatened. Naturally, I'm not going to be learning as much as I could if I didn't have those negative feelings.
And with the idea behind it, or one of the ideas behind it being, I suppose, if you're more at ease, you're more relaxed, that's going to be a bit more supportive for learning.
Yeah, and there were old approaches, with things like the silent way, where you might sit down and relax and just sort of, or Suggestopedia, in fact, I was thinking of, where you would just be so relaxed, this language magically appears in your head. Now that's taking it to an extreme, but really we'd be looking at the idea where you're more accessible to input, and when you have tuition and language input, if you don't feel threatened by it, you feel comfortable with it, then you're less likely to have a negative emotional reaction, and therefore the affective filters will not kick in and inhibit your learning.
Let's talk a little bit about classroom assessment. Because I think sometimes when people talk about affective filters, it might be to do with more summative assessment, but I think it can do with classroom assessment as well. Would you agree?
Looking only at assessment then, traditionally assessment has a bad name, and actually there's a whole load of emotions that go with it, and generally you just say the word assessment to a student of any age, a test, we're going to do a test tomorrow, they immediately have this negative, I hate tests, not all, but most do. So there is that baggage that already comes with the notion of assessment, and it's something that's not quite right. I mean, I'm sure, Ben, you've had loads of experiences in your own teaching where in the classroom you see a reaction to assessment.
Yeah, I mean, I think even going back to before I was a teacher and a student, I have a particular example I always seem to remember of a teacher asking me a question. It was a math teacher, as it happens, and I knew the answer to the question, but I didn't know the question was coming. The teacher said, "Ben, what's the answer to 4B," or whatever the question was, and I froze. I didn't know. My mind just went blank. Because it was just a complete surprise, and I felt unprepared, and I knew what the answer was. And then before I had a chance to kind of gather myself, the teacher said, "Okay, you don't know," on to another person, and I felt that was quite a negative experience. And obviously still a formative experience for me now as I reflect back on it.
But it's interesting to note that exam phobia, I mean, it's a classical, not a classical, but a classified clinical condition, and there are some individuals who, looking at a whole test or any summative assessment, they're so threatened by it, they will freeze, they can't think. And in fact, we know a lot about cognitively what's going on, all to do with your neurotransmitters, but it's not that you're stupid, it's just literally you cannot think because of various processes in the brain.
And so really it can be a barrier to learning, and so teachers and perhaps students need to be aware of this as well. They need to know that this can happen. And as you say, it's not that they're stupid, it's just that maybe the assessment needs to be framed in a slightly more friendly way, a way that the student is better able to respond to if they're going to perform at their best.
Perhaps we need to separate what we mean with affective filters with learning and affective filters with assessment. We've been talking about it because they very much overlap.
Yeah.
But within the classroom, as a teacher, I need to think of what the affective filters are and how I can mitigate and how I can remove their influence if they're negative. And it's exactly the same with assessment, but obviously you're working in a slightly different arena if I'm actually working with some form of test or an exam, then I might look at the measures of how I can enable the emotional reaction to be one that's positive and conducive to better results. But it's the same with learning. If you can lower the affective filters, we know that will enhance the learning, or it won't inhibit it, as the opposite.
And so let's talk a little bit more about exams, because I think there are, as you say, there are connections there. It's not atomistic, it's quite holistic in how we're looking at this. What can we do to help support accurate assessment and prevent students from or candidates having these filters applied and lowering their ability in exams?
For me, it's really about the nature of assessment. That if I'm going to put you through a situation, a context in a test that is foreign, it's alien to me, it's challenging and difficult because it's just not natural, then I'm going to have a negative reaction. There's a notion, something called bias for best in testing, that if you introduce bias for best, you're going to give the candidate, the student, the best possible opportunity to show you what they can do. Now, that means that it has to be as authentic and as natural as possible. So if you imagine that you're going to ask a candidate to do something that they really would do in real life, something they really would do outside with their friends and so on and so forth, this is going to be something the candidate is very confident with. And this is why bias for best can really reduce affective filters. A really practical example of this would be personalisation. So if you have a test that really personalises, so the candidate can talk about themselves, their own life, they can communicate in a way that's authentic, they're far more likely to be less stressed because it is real for them and they're not having to do something that's just not entirely natural. But I think there's another argument, and I think you're the expert here, Ben, on transparency as well, about the candidates knowing about what's in the test.
I wouldn't call myself an expert by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, I think transparency of assessment is really, really helpful. Both for transparency in learning, as I mentioned earlier, when I had that negative experience in a maths class and I didn't know this question was coming and that stressed me. Moving that to a different level, to an awarding organisation level or an exam level, then I think it's very helpful to know why you're being assessed, what you're being assessed on, so that we can actually prepare for that assessment. No surprises, please. I think it's something we might want. So I think, I just think it's very important that if the students know what it is they're being assessed on, so that if they're being asked to produce, be it a language point or a fact or evaluate something, they know they have to evaluate, otherwise it's unfair. Or if they suddenly get into a written test scenario and they find out that they've got to analyse something and they haven't done any practice analysing things, then that's going to be quite negative. So I think awarding organisations or exam boards or whoever need to make sure that assessment criteria are clear, they're transparent, so that everyone knows what the goals are, and the goals aren't the goalposts aren't being mysteriously moved somewhere.
Absolutely, and you can imagine the horror if you're sitting an exam and then something is thrown at you, you're asked to do something you don't expect or you don't really know why. Again, the affective filters will kick in, the response will be hampered. It's quite often the case.
As well as having transparency, I think there are other positive spin-offs we can use assessment for in terms of helping to lower the negative filters. Can you think of any examples for these?
Well, it really depends whether we're looking at the summative kind of assessment. So you have these tests that are often high stakes, more important tests, or end of term and so on. But we also have the more formative assessment. So assessment doesn't always have to be the big end of course paper or so on. So there's a lot of discussion now about assessment for learning, this idea that actually the whole learning process, assessment is written into the fabric of that process. So therefore you would have loop feedback, gentle feedback throughout a whole course, so you don't have that emotional response to it because it's actually part of the learning process every day, every part of the learning you're in. And there's a lot of activities that teachers can learn how to implement assessment for learning. Opportunities here for sort of portfolio assessment, sample assessment where we take little bits of what a candidate or a student does over a sustained period of time. So that becomes more or less onerous on one particular assessment and therefore less stressful. The affective filters are lessened.
And by embedding that kind of thing throughout a course, let's say a course of study, by embedding these little assessment tasks, seeing how the feedback can be used to help develop learning. And so students can be almost measure themselves ipsatively kind of against their previous progress, that they can see the benefit of it and thereby get a bit less worried about the assessment, and it becomes less of a scary thing.
And it has to be transparent to do that. And therefore, if we talk about ipsative assessment, the idea that I actually have a view of everything I've done and where I'm going, so this becomes a dialogue, actually. So it's not something closed and behind a book that the teacher's doing. This is something that is a process that the candidate or the student is completely involved with, and often they will steer it as well. So yes, affective filters can be very much reduced, but it's still the formative assessment over a period of time. So you still get an overall performance, if you like, from the candidate or student.
All right, Alex, thank you very much.
Ben, thank you.